Good everyone, so welcome to the next in the series of mini online lectures. And in this lecture, what I'm going to do is continue to talk about endophytes. And what we're going to do is to talk about class 1 endophytes. So I didn't mention much about those in the previous mini lecture, but we're now going to focus on those. And we're going to use them as a general example to try and understand the basic features of endophytes. We do this because the class 1 endophytes are particularly well understood and so make a good illustrative system. And that means that much of the material I'm going to talk about is relevant not just for the class 1 endophytes, but across endophytes generally. And this is going to cover this mini lecture plus the next few. And so what I'm going to do as usual is turn off my video and then we'll start going through the slides. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm looking at the class 1 endophytes, and these are otherwise known as the clavicipitaceous endophytes or the epicloe endophytes. Now, the epicloe is a genus, and there's many species of epicloe endophytes. But class 1 endophytes don't only consist of epicloe. There's a variety of other genera that are also included in the class 1 endophytes. But epicloe is the most well-known and well-characterized of the epicloe endophytes. And so that's what I'm going to mostly focus on in these lectures. So these endophytes form mutualistic relationships with grasses from the family Poaceae. And in this picture, obviously, we're showing a diagram of a grass plant. And the endophytes live in the above ground parts of the plant, so the leaves and the stems. And in particular, they live in the intercellular spaces, and that's what's shown by these two photographs on the left and the right of the diagram. So on the right here, we've got the plant cells are kind of the clear pale blue things, and then the darkly stained blue lines, these are the fungal endophyte hyphae that are running between the cells. And you can perhaps view that a bit more clearly on the electron micrograph on the left. And here the stem has been cut, and now you're looking down onto that stem. And so PC means plant cells, so there's 3 plant cells, and then there's the gap in between the plant cells. And inside there you see this thing called E. E stands for endophyte, and so this is the endophyte hypha growing in the intercellular spaces. And this fungus not only grows in the leaves and the stems, but it will grow up into the flowers of the grass when they flower. And this is one of the ways that it gets transmitted. So it grows through into the flower and ends up in the seed. And so the fungus again is stained in blue here, and you can see that in the seeds there's fungus indicated by the blue coloring in all the seeds in that flower head. And so in that way the fungus is in the seed, and then when that seed germinates, the next grass that grows up will have the fungal endophyte in it. Now, these endophytes are the most important organism in New Zealand that nobody knows about. Not exactly true, but they're very poorly known, despite the fact that they're critical for New Zealand's pastoral economy. And so that means that they're important for agriculture, particularly sheep and cattle, or sheep and cows, cattle or dairy. And so they are quite well studied because they're important for the grasses that these animals feed on, but very few people are aware that these fungi exist inside these grasses. So let's move to the next slide, slide number 2. And here what I'm pointing out is that these epicloe endophytes have both sexual and asexual species. So I talked about the fact that fungi can have asexual parts of their life cycle, and some of them have sexual parts of their life cycle, and some fungi have both asexual and sexual parts of their life cycle. And that is true for the epicloe species. So some epicloe species are sexual. They produce reproductive structures. And when they do that, the reproductive structures that the fungi produce prevent the development of the grass flower. So they stop the sexual reproduction of the grass. So you can kind of think of these things in a way as pathogens because they're preventing reproduction of the grass and therefore causing problems for the grass. There are some epicloe species, however, that never go through the sexual cycle, so they only ever go through the asexual part of the life cycle. And in this case, they always grow into the seeds and they are vertically transmitted. And I'll explain what vertical transmission means in a moment. And so in this case, they're totally dependent on their host. They've got no way to jump across into a different grass individual. So if the grass individual they live in dies, then the endophytes die with them. And there's actually a kind of a continuum. So some of the sexual species will sometimes produce their sexual reproductive structures and kill off the host grass flowers, but sometimes they won't. They'll just go through the asexual cycle and grow up into the seed. So the sexual species can use a mix of sexual and or asexual approaches to reproduction. And these asexual and sexual species are not separate groups of organisms, and so there's a phylogenetic tree shown here. You don't need to know the details, but the point that I'm trying to make is that scattered throughout sexual and asexual species. And this is something that Marge will touch on a little bit in one of her later lectures, is sexual and asexual species taxonomy. So I go to slide number 3, and this is a bit of an aside, but just to describe what I mean by vertical versus horizontal transmission of endophytes. So vertical transmission is what I described, the asexual cycle that I described. So let's start up here with a seed that has endophyte that's grown into it, and that seed will germinate, produce a grass, and that grass will have endophyte inside it. That grass can clonally propagate through tillering, but eventually the grass will go through the sexual cycle and it will produce grass flowers and eventually seeds. And the hyphae grow up into these grass flowers, they grow into the ovule and therefore the fungi in the seed, and so they can be passed on. And so in this sense, they're only ever passed on to the progeny of the original grass in which the endophyte grew. They've got no way through this cycle of being able to jump into different grass individuals. And so this is why it's called vertical transmission. It's like being vertically passed on from parents to children. In contrast, we can look at horizontal transmission, which is what happens in the sexual cycle. So in some cases, if there's a sexual species, then in the grass flower, the fungus will produce its own sexually reproducing structures. So these are the structures that contain the asci, that contain the ascospores. And these will prevent development of that grass flower. And when they do this, they will produce the ascospores, and the ascospores can float around, and eventually they can be introduced into a different host grass. And so they can kind of inoculate or infect a different host grass, and therefore be transferred from one grass individual to another one, not just through descent from parents through to progeny. And so that's what's meant by horizontal transmission, jumping across to different host grasses. And the horizontal transmission occurs through spores, and these are the fungal ascospores, whereas the vertical transmission occurs via the seed, but that's the grass seed. Okay, so hopefully that's clear, and let's move on now to slide number 4. So here I want to introduce the idea that we can think about fungal pathogens and fungal mutualists rather than being a separate state, instead as being parts of a continuum. And so on one side of the continuum, we have things that are very pathogenic. On the other side of the continuum, you have things that are very mutualistic. And right exactly in the middle, you have things that are commensal. And so these are organisms where the partner neither benefits nor is disadvantaged by the other symbiotic partner. And so it turns out that when you think about fungi, often this is a more productive way to think about it than just saying, oh, that's a pathogen, oh, that's a mutualist. And if we look at the epicloe endophytes, these are a very good illustration of this point. So I told you that epicloe endophytes that are sexual will suppress the host plant reproduction by killing off the flowers. And that's what's shown here. So this is a photograph I took in Ohope. And this is of a grass seed that, as you can see, perhaps almost all the grass flower has been kind of taken over by the fungal sexual structures. So the fungal sexual structures are the black things. These are the fruiting bodies that produce the asci, that produce the ascospores. And so almost all the grass flowers have been taken over by these fungal sexual bodies, which means the fungus can't produce, the grass can't produce seed. And there's maybe a few down here that are still okay. But basically, this fungus has sterilized this grass floret. So in this case, you can kind of think of these epicloe endophytes in this sense as being pathogens because they're suppressing host plant reproduction. And these are the very strongly sexual species. But we can go down to the asexual species, and these asexual species never produce this effect here. They just grow up into the seed, but they never affect the production of seed. They don't suppress host grass reproduction. And so you could kind of consider these to be commensal because they're just growing in the grass and they're not suppressing the host reproduction. And so depending on how much an epicloe endophyte produces the sexual stage versus just doing this asexual thing depends where on this continuum it might lie. So let's go to slide number 5. But I told you that endophytes are mutualists. This whole section is about mutualism. So how are they mutualists? If we're just going between pathogenicity and mutualism, how are these things mutualists? So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how these things are mutualist. So endophytes like epicloe derive their nutrition from their host plants. They consume sugars that the host plants make by photosynthesis. And the point here is that the plants could use those sugars that they make themselves if the fungus wasn't using them, so they could use them for growth or whatever else, reproduction, whatever it happens to be. So there is a cost to these endophytes living in the plant and using these sugars, obviously. So even if they don't interfere with reproduction, these asexual endophytes are still a cost to their host plants. And so that really begs the question, well, why do we say they're mutualists or even commensals? Why are they not all pathogens or parasites? And of course, the answer is that they provide benefits to the host plant. And so I'm going to finish up this mini lecture there. And in the next mini lecture, we're going to come back and we're going to look at the benefits that these class 1 endophytes provide to their host plant as a way of thinking more deeply about how they provide mutualism, and also as a way of thinking more deeply about that continuum between pathogenicity at one extreme and mutualism at the other extreme. So as usual, if you have any questions, please post them to Piazza and look out for the next mini lecture.